The Wild West was unforgiving, cold, ruthless, and often cruel. But sometimes, in the darkest places, a single act of kindness can change everything. When a stranger offers help with no expectations, is it a risk or the beginning of something greater? Stay until the end, because this story proves that even in the harshest world, humanity still survives.
The Kansas wind didn't just blow, it bit. It was late October, 1878. The sky over Oak Creek hung low and gray, heavy with the threat of early snow. Clara Jane Bennett stood dead in the center of the main street. The red dust swirled. It caught in the frayed hem of her wool dress. It stung her eyes. She didn't blink. Her left hand rested on the swell of her belly. 6 months gone. The child moved inside her. A slow, rolling flutter. A reminder. In her right hand, she held a piece of paper. The edges were crumpled from how tight her grip was. It was a death certificate. William Bennett, dead of typhoid fever, September 14th, just over 3 weeks ago. Clara looked at the town around her. Wooden storefronts, muddy boardwalks, eyes watching her from behind the smeared glass of the apothecary and the general store. They knew who she was. They knew what she was. A widow, pregnant, alone. Out here, a woman without a man to speak for her wasn't just a tragedy. She was a liability. She took a breath. The cold air burned her lungs. She had knocked on 7 doors since the stagecoach dropped her off at dawn. 7 boarding houses and private homes with rooms to let. 7 doors opened, 7 doors closed. The rejections played in her head, keeping rhythm with her footsteps as she walked toward the end of the street. "We don't take in women in your condition, Mrs. Bennett. It sets a bad example for my daughters. No husband, no family. Who's going to pay when the baby comes? I run a business, not a charity. It hasn't even been 40 days since your husband passed, and look at you. Folks talk, you know." That last one had stung the most. The quiet, insidious judgment. The implication that she was somehow unclean, a moral stain on their pristine frontier town. Clara reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against another piece of paper. A letter from William's brother, Henry, living 2 towns over. She had written to him, begging for a corner in his barn for the winter. His reply had arrived yesterday. "Don't come here, Clara. I can't feed another mouth. Besides, William told me before he died, that child ain't his blood. I won't harbor a woman like you." It was a lie. A filthy, cowardly lie made up by a man who didn't want the financial burden of his dead brother's family. But the lie worked. It was a trap of honor. She had no way to prove him wrong. Henry had stolen her good name, and in the West, a woman's good name was the only currency that kept her from freezing in the dirt. She was out of money. The winter was coming, and the sun was starting to dip behind the ragged line of the horizon. There was only one place left, the white, clapboard Baptist church at the edge of town. Clara pushed the heavy oak doors open. The church was empty, smelling of beeswax and old hymnals. She found Reverend Miller in his study at the back. A fire was crackling in the grate. It was the first real warmth Clara had felt all day. The Reverend was a soft-looking man, gray hair, spectacles. He poured her a cup of hot black tea and gestured to a leather chair. Clara sat. She wrapped her freezing fingers around the porcelain cup. She told him her situation, simply, without tears. She didn't have the luxury of crying. Reverend Miller listened. He nodded slowly, steepling his fingers. "It is a harsh world, Mrs. Bennett," he said softly. His voice was smooth, practiced. "The Lord tests us in mysterious ways." "I'm not looking for answers to mysteries, Reverend," Clara said. Her voice was steady. "I am looking for work. I can cook. I can clean. I was a schoolteacher in Tennessee. I know herbal medicine. I just need a room for the winter." The Reverend sighed. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "Oak Creek is a God-fearing town, Clara. We have standards of decency. Taking in a pregnant widow with questionable backing from her own family. It causes a stir. The congregation would not approve of church funds going to someone who cannot prove the sanctity of her marriage. Clara stared at his back. The warmth of the tea suddenly felt like ash in her mouth. However, Reverend Miller turned back, offering a small, tight smile. There is a Christian solution. The church has a family in Kansas City. Good, upstanding people, wealthy, barren. They are looking for an infant. He walked back to his desk. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and set it in front of her. Next to it, an inkwell and a pen. We will put you up in the church attic until the child comes. We will feed you. Ensure a safe delivery. In exchange, you will sign this paper. You will relinquish your maternal rights. You will give the child to a proper, respectable family. You will then be given $20 and a ticket on the stagecoach heading east. A fresh start. Clara looked at the paper. Then she looked at the pen. The fire popped in the grate. The silence in the room was absolute. Slowly, Clara set her teacup down on the saucer. The porcelain clinked, a sharp, final sound. She placed her hands on the arms of the chair and pushed herself up. Her back was straight, her chin raised. She looked Reverend Miller dead in the eye. True religion does not trade a mother's love for a loaf of bread, Pastor, Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. It cut through the warm air of the room like a blade. Motherhood is an inalienable human right. It is not a commodity to be bargained with. A woman's dignity and her right to raise her own flesh and blood is not yours to purchase. You speak of decency, but you are trying to buy a human being. The Reverend blinked, stepping back as if she had struck him. Mrs. Bennet, be reasonable. You will freeze in the street. I would rather freeze knowing I am a free woman, Clara said, than be well fed as a slave to your hypocritical charity. She turned on her heel. She walked out of the study, down the aisle, out the heavy oak doors. She didn't look back. Night fell hard. The temperature plummeted. It was dropping toward 20 degrees, the kind of cold that slipped under your skin and settled in your bones. Clara stood in the alleyway behind the saloon. Her teeth were chattering, her hands were numb. She had to survive the night. She couldn't afford a room. She couldn't stay on the street. She looked at the saloon's livery stable. The heavy barn doors were pulled shut, but not latched. It was trespassing. It was dangerous. But the child kicked again, a sharp jab against her ribs. She wasn't just surviving for herself anymore. Clara slipped through the gap in the doors. It was pitch black inside. The air was thick with the smell of horse sweat, old leather, and dry straw. It was marginally warmer than outside. She felt her way along the wooden stalls until she found an empty one in the back corner. She sank to her knees. She dragged a pile of loose hay into a corner, burying herself under it, pulling her thin wool shawl tight around her shoulders. She curled into a ball, wrapping her arms protectively over her stomach. She closed her eyes. She focused on her breathing. In, out. Stay awake. If you sleep in this cold, you don't wake up. An hour passed, maybe 2. Her fingers had lost all feeling. Then, the heavy wooden door of the barn groaned open. Clara's breath hitched. She froze. Heavy boots crunched against the dirt floor, steady, deliberate. The golden glow of a hurricane lantern cut through the darkness, throwing long, monstrous shadows against the barn walls. A man. He was walking down the center aisle, checking the horses. Clara pressed herself harder into the corner, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear into the hay. The footsteps stopped right in front of her stall. The lantern was raised. The light spilled over the top rail, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Then the light angled down. It hit the pile of hay. It hit Clara's boots. It moved up, resting on her face. Clara threw a hand up to shield her eyes from the sudden glare. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just braced herself. The man holding the lantern was massive, broad-shouldered, dressed in a thick canvas coat and worn denim. His face was weathered, lined by the sun and the wind, partially shadowed by the brim of a dark Stetson. His hands, gripping the wire handle of the lantern, were large and rough. He didn't yell. He didn't draw a gun. He just stood there, looking at her. His eyes moved from her face down to the obvious swell of her belly beneath the shawl, then back up to her eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy and taut. Clara stared back. If he tries to drag me out, she thought, I will fight. I will bite and kick. The man lowered the lantern slightly. He let out a slow, quiet breath that plumed white in the freezing air. When he spoke, his voice was a deep, gravelly baritone. It wasn't angry, it was just tired, and incredibly firm. The temperature is dropping below 20 tonight, he said. Clara didn't flinch. I know. He looked at her for a long moment. He didn't ask what she was doing there. He didn't ask where her husband was. He didn't ask how she got into this mess. He set the lantern down on the wooden rail. This town may have thrown you away, the man said, his words ringing out clear and deliberate in the quiet barn. But human beings cannot be treated like trash just because they stumbled. Every life is sacred, ma'am, including the life beating in your womb and your own. Clara stopped breathing. She stared at him. She had heard sermons on charity all day. But this wasn't a sermon. This was a statement of fact from a man who sounded like he had seen the devil and refused to shake his hand. The man tipped his hat back slightly. My name is Silas Thorne. I have a ranch 6 miles north of here. I need a housekeeper to cook and keep the place running through the winter. I pay with safe lodging and good food. That's it. Clara sat up slowly. The hay rustled around her. She studied him. Silas Thorne, a stranger offering salvation in the middle of the night. It was a risk, a massive risk. But as she looked into his dark, quiet eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in Oak Creek all day. Respect. I accept this shelter through my own labor, Mr. Thorne, Clara said, her voice finally finding its strength. She pulled herself to her feet, brushing the straw from her dress. She stood as tall as she could. We are equals in your house. There is no benefactor here, and no debtor. Silas didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched just a fraction. It was a look of profound understanding. Respect is not dependent on gender or circumstance, Mrs. Bennet, Silas said. Your labor is your currency. He reached down and picked up the lantern. He turned toward the barn doors. My wagon is out front. Let's get you warm. The wagon ride was a frozen hell. 6 miles, it felt like 60. The wind whipped across the open plains, biting through Clara's thin wool coat. She sat rigid on the wooden bench. Every jolt of the wagon wheels sent a sharp ache up her spine. She held her hands over her belly, shielding it. Silas Thorne sat beside her. He drove the team of draft horses with a quiet, practiced ease. He didn't speak. He didn't offer empty comforts. He just kept his eyes on the dark road ahead. Clara watched his hands on the leather reins. Thick knuckles, calloused skin. Steady. An hour passed. The lights of Oak Creek faded into nothing. There was only the black prairie and a smattering of cold stars. Finally, the wagon slowed. A silhouette emerged from the darkness. A cabin, built of solid, thick-cut timber. A barn sat 100 yards back. Corrals, a smokehouse. It wasn't grand, but it was sturdy. It looked like a place that could take a beating and stay standing. Silas pulled the horses to a halt. He wrapped the reins around the brake lever. He climbed down, his boots hitting the hard-packed dirt with a heavy thud. He walked around to her side and offered a hand. Clara looked at it. She hesitated. Then she took it. His grip was warm, iron-strong but gentle. She stepped down. Her legs were numb. She swayed slightly. Silas didn't catch her waist. He just steadied her arm, giving her room to find her own balance. He unlatched the cabin door. He struck a match against the doorframe. He lit a kerosene lamp on a side table. Yellow light spilled across the room. It was a bachelor's home, stark, clean, cold. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner. A heavy oak table, 2 chairs, one rocking chair near the dead fire. No rugs, no curtains, no softness anywhere. Silas set her small canvas bag on a chair. He turned to face her. "The bedroom is through that door," he said. His voice was low. "It has a good mattress, plenty of quilts. I sleep in the loft. You have the run of the ground floor." Clara stood by the table. She didn't take off her coat. Not yet. She needed the ground rules set before she surrendered to the warmth. "Mr. Thorne," Clara said. Her voice was scratchy from the cold but steady. "I need you to understand something before I sleep under this roof." Silas crossed his arms. He waited. "I accept this shelter through my own labor," Clara stated, holding his dark gaze. "I will cook. I will mend. I will keep this house. But we are equals in this house. There is no benefactor here, and I am no debtor. I am not a charity case." Silas didn't blink. He looked at her proud, exhausted face. He looked at the way she held her chin up even though she was trembling from the cold. "Respect is not dependent on gender or circumstance, Mrs. Bennet," Silas said clearly. "Your labor is your currency. You earn your keep. I earn mine. The law might say a woman needs a man to speak for her, but under this roof your word weighs the same as mine. Is that understood?" Clara felt a knot in her chest loosen. Just a fraction. "It is," she said. "Good. There is firewood in the bin, beans and salt pork in the pantry. Get some sleep." He turned and walked back out the door to tend the horses. Clara watched the door click shut. She let out a long, shaky breath. She walked over to the bedroom. She pushed the door open. A bed frame, a thick mattress ticking, a stack of heavy wool blankets. She laid down. She didn't even take off her boots. She just pulled the blankets over her shivering shoulders. She closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Morning broke, gray and freezing. Clara woke before the sun. A habit from her teaching days, a habit from her marriage. The air in the bedroom was bitter. She sat up. Her lower back ached. The baby shifted, a heavy pressure against her pelvis. She rubbed her stomach. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She walked out into the main room. It was warm. The fire in the hearth was already blazing. The iron stove was radiating heat. A pot of water sat on top, letting out a thin curl of steam. Silas was gone. Clara walked over to the oak table. A piece of brown butcher paper sat in the center, weighted down by a single shiny red apple. She picked up the paper. The handwriting was neat, precise, the handwriting of an educated man. "Mrs. Bennet, pantry is fully stocked. Root cellar is out back. Door is latched tight. Do what you see fit with the kitchen. Rule 1, do not chop wood. I will handle the axe. Rule 2, do not lift anything over 10 pounds. Leave the heavy sacks for me. I will be back by noon. S. Thorne." Clara stared at the note. 10 pounds. He had noticed. He knew exactly what a woman 6 months along should and shouldn't do. She set the note down. She picked up the apple. She took a bite. It was sweet, crisp. She went to work. The kitchen was functional, but chaotic. Flour sacks stacked too close to the heat. Spices haphazardly thrown in a wooden crate. She rolled up her sleeves. She tied one of Silas's spare flour sack towels around her waist as an apron. She moved slowly, deliberately. She shifted the lighter tins. She reorganized the pantry shelves. She washed the cast-iron skillets with hot water and coarse salt. By mid-morning, the kitchen looked completely different. It looked intentional. She opened a tall wooden cabinet near the back wall, looking for a place to store the extra salt. She stopped. The bottom 2 shelves were packed with medical supplies. Not just standard rancher fare, not just horse liniment and bandages. Glass bottles of ether, vials of laudanum, carbolic acid, hemostats, forceps, and a worn leather roll. Clara reached out. She touched the leather. It was soft from years of use. She untied the leather cord. She unrolled it on the kitchen table. Surgical instruments, scalpels, bone saws, suture needles. They were made of high-quality steel, but they were dull, tarnished, neglected, like they had been shoved in a dark corner and deliberately forgotten. Clara was a herbalist. She knew plant medicine, but her mother had also been a midwife. Clara knew the tools of cutting and sewing. She looked at the tarnished scalpels. She thought of Silas's hands, the precise, heavy knuckles. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pry. Instead, she boiled a fresh pot of water. She found a block of hard lye soap. She found a soft cotton rag. For the next 2 hours, Clara sat at the table. She scrubbed every single instrument. She polished the steel until it gleamed. She wiped down the glass vials. She neatly arranged the hemostats. She folded the leather roll back up, perfectly aligned. She placed the medical supplies back in the cabinet, neat, organized, respected. It was a silent conversation. He had set a fire for her. She had sharpened his tools. At noon, the front door opened. Silas walked in. He brought the smell of frost and horse sweat with him. He took off his hat. He hung it on a peg. He stopped. He looked at the kitchen. He saw the reorganized shelves. He smelled the fresh coffee boiling on the stove. He saw the pan of cornbread cooling on the rack. Then his eyes drifted to the tall wooden cabinet. He walked over to it. He opened the door. He looked at the gleaming glass bottles. He saw the leather roll perfectly tied. He stood there for a long time, his back to her. His shoulders were rigid. The silence in the cabin grew thick, heavy. Clara stood by the stove. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. Finally, Silas closed the cabinet door. The click of the latch sounded loud in the quiet room. He turned around. He looked at her. His dark eyes were unreadable. A storm of old ghosts and present realities. "Lunch is ready," Clara said quietly. Silas pulled out a chair. He sat down. He looked at the hot meal placed in front of him. "Thank you," he said. The words were rough, scraped out of a throat not used to saying them. "You're welcome," Clara replied. They ate in silence. The fire cracked in the hearth. The rules were set, the boundaries drawn. But the ice, thick and black, had begun to crack. A week passed. A quiet rhythm settled over the Thorn Ranch. Clara ruled the inside. Silas ruled the outside. They crossed paths at meals, sharing brief functional words. "Pass the salt. Weather's turning. Need more flour." But the silence between them wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two battered animals sharing the same shade tree. Wary, exhausted, content to just breathe. Dawn on the 8th day was brutal. The sky was the color of bruised iron. The wind had a teeth-rattling howl to it. Clara woke with a sharp ache in her lower back. She pushed herself up, wincing. She dressed slowly, pulling a thick woolen sweater over her swelling stomach. She walked into the kitchen. The fire was lit. Silas was already out in the barn. Clara put a pot of oats on the stove. She wrapped her shawl tight and stepped out the back door to fetch a bucket of fresh water from the pump. The wind hit her like a physical blow. She gasped, squinting against the stinging dust. She made her way to the barn to grab the wooden bucket. She pulled open the heavy side door. The barn was warmer, smelling of sweet hay and manure. She heard a low, frustrated curse from the milking stalls. Clara walked quietly down the center aisle. She stopped. Silas was sitting on a 3-legged stool next to a large, mottled brown cow. He had a tin pail trapped between his knees. He was trying to milk her. But his hands were too hard. His rhythm was too rushed. He was impatient. The cow shifted her weight. She tossed her head, her ears pinned back. She kicked out, her hoof slamming into the tin pail. The pail tipped. A splash of white milk spilled into the dirt. Silas sighed, a harsh, heavy sound. He wiped a hand across his face. He looked defeated. Not angry, just deeply, profoundly tired. Clara stepped out of the shadows. "You're stripping the teat, Mr. Thorne," she said. Silas jumped slightly. He looked over his shoulder. He frowned. "She's stubborn this morning." "She's not stubborn, she's anxious," Clara said. She walked closer. She didn't ask for permission. She stood right next to him. "You're gripping too tight," Clara explained. "You're pulling down like you're ringing a heavy church bell. It pinches. It causes the milk ducts to cramp." Silas looked down at his large, rough hands. Hands meant for swinging an axe, for pulling a plow, for holding a rifle. "How do you know?" he asked. "My mother taught me," Clara said. "Plant medicine is about understanding the natural flow of things. Animals are the same. You have to tell her body it's safe to release." Clara reached out. She didn't touch his hands. She placed her own hands gently on the cow's flank, right in front of the udder. "Don't pull the teat," Clara instructed. Her voice was calm, soothing. "Form a ring with your thumb and forefinger at the top. Close your fingers down in sequence, like a wave. Trap the milk, then press it out. Don't drag the skin." Silas watched her hands. Then he turned back to the udder. He tried it. Thumb and forefinger. A wave of the knuckles. A steady, rhythmic squeeze. A thick stream of white milk hit the bottom of the tin pail. Ping, ping. The cow let out a long, shuddering breath. Her ears relaxed. She dropped her head and started chewing her cud. Silas established the rhythm. Left, right, left, right. The pail began to fill. He didn't stop milking, but he looked up at Clara. His eyes held a genuine, unmasked surprise. "I've been fighting this animal for 2 years," Silas said softly. "I thought it was just her temperament." Clara crossed her arms against the cold. She looked down at him. "Knowledge is not the exclusive privilege of men, Silas, nor is it only found in expensive universities," Clara stated firmly, her voice carrying clear over the rhythmic sound of the milk hitting the tin. "When we open our minds to learn from others, regardless of their station, and share our understanding without pride, we save ourselves and the creatures around us. Ignorance is just a choice to remain blind." Silas stopped milking for a split second. The weight of her words settled over him. He absorbed them. He didn't brush them off as women's talk. He didn't get defensive. He nodded once. A slow, respectful dip of his chin. "You're right," Silas said. "I chose to be blind because asking for help felt like a weakness. Thank you, Clara." It was the first time he used her given name. It felt heavy, important. Clara nodded back. "I'll get the water." By noon, the sky turned black. The wind shifted from a howl to a sustained, terrifying roar. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. A Kansas blizzard. Silas came rushing into the cabin, his coat dusted with fine, powdery snow. "It's a bad one," he said, grabbing the thick canvas tarps from the corner. "I need to secure the barn doors. Drop extra feed. I might be out there a while. Do not open this door for anyone." "I won't," Clara said. He grabbed his lantern and vanished into the blinding white wall outside. Clara went to work. She dragged every piece of cut wood closer to the hearth. She filled 3 heavy iron pots with water and set them on the stove to boil. She pulled the heavy wooden shutters closed over the windows, throwing the heavy iron latches. The cabin grew dark. The only light came from the fire and the oil lamps. The wind screamed against the timber walls. The cabin groaned, but it held tight. An hour passed. 2 hours. The cold began to seep through the floorboards. Clara sat in the rocking chair by the fire. Suddenly, her stomach tightened. A vicious, seizing cramp ripped through her lower abdomen. She gasped, doubling over. She gripped the wooden arms of the chair. Her knuckles turned white. "Braxton Hicks," she told herself. "Just practice contractions. It's the cold. It's the stress." But it hurt. God, it hurt. She squeezed her eyes shut, riding the wave of pain. It crested. It broke. It faded into a dull, throbbing ache. The front door suddenly flew open. Snow and violent wind blasted into the room. Silas shoved the door shut behind him, throwing his entire weight against the heavy oak to throw the deadbolt. He was covered in ice. His beard was frozen white. His lips were blue. He dropped his lantern and stripped off his heavy coat, shivering violently. Clara stood up. Another cramp hit her. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table. Silas saw her. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He didn't touch her, but his hands hovered, ready to catch her. "What is it?" he demanded. His voice was sharp with panic. "Cramps," Clara breathed out, her eyes tight. "Just the cold, the muscles." Silas didn't hesitate. He turned away. He grabbed a large tin basin from the wall. He dragged it near the hearth. He poured the boiling water from the stove into it, cutting it with a dipper of cold water from the barrel until it steamed perfectly. He went to his medical cabinet. He pulled down a heavy glass jar, Epsom salts. He dumped a generous handful into the hot water. He pushed the rocking chair closer to the basin. "Sit," Silas commanded. It wasn't a request. Clara sat. She was in too much pain to argue. Silas knelt on the hard wooden floor in front of her. He reached out and unlaced her heavy leather boots. He pulled them off. He peeled off her thick wool socks. His hands were still freezing, but he was incredibly gentle. He lifted her bare, swollen feet and guided them into the steaming, salted water. The heat shot up Clara's legs. The magnesium in the salt immediately began to work on her seizing muscles. She let out a long, ragged sigh, letting her head fall back against the rocking chair. Silas stayed kneeling for a moment. He looked at her pale face. He watched the tension slowly drain from her shoulders. Then he stood up. He walked away without a word. Clara opened her eyes. She watched him walk to his loft stairs. He was still shivering. "Silas," Clara called out softly. He stopped. He looked back. "There's a bowl on the stove," she said. "Beef stew. I kept it close to the fire. It's hot. Eat it before you freeze from the inside out." Silas looked at the stove. A heavy cast-iron Dutch oven sat on the hottest part of the iron. Next to it, a clean bowl and a spoon, waiting for him. He looked back at Clara, her feet resting in the basin he made, the steam rising between them. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He walked to the stove. He poured the thick, rich stew into the bowl. He sat at the table. He ate in the dim light of the cabin, the blizzard raging uselessly against the thick timber walls outside. In the quiet warmth of the kitchen, surrounded by a storm that could kill a man in minutes, they were no longer just a pregnant widow and a broken doctor. They were 2 people keeping each other alive. The snow began to melt in late November. It didn't bring relief. It just turned the world to mud. Thick, sucking, freezing mud. Silas was out near the northern fence line. Clara was on the porch. She was sweeping the dirt away from the doorboards. She paused. She leaned on the broom handle. She pressed a hand to the small of her back. The baby was heavy now, growing fast. Then she heard it. The rhythmic, sloppy thud of hooves hitting mud. A rider was coming up the trail. Clara squinted against the pale winter sun. It wasn't a farmer. The horse was too fine. A tall, sleek black gelding. The saddle was tooled leather. Expensive. The rider sat straight. He wore a heavy wool coat and a bowler hat. Pinned to his chest was a circle of silver, a star. Sheriff Thaddeus Vance. Clara's grip on the broom tightened. She had seen Vance in town. He was the kind of man who smiled with his mouth but never with his eyes. A man who owned half the storefronts in Oak Creek and wanted the other half. Silas saw him, too. He dropped his post-hole digger. He walked toward the cabin. His strides were long, deliberate. He didn't run, but he ate up the ground between them fast. Vance pulled his horse to a halt right at the edge of the porch. The horse snorted, stomping a muddy hoof. "Morning, Silas," Vance called out. His voice was loud, too loud for the quiet prairie. It was the voice of a man used to being listened to. Silas stepped up to the porch. He stood between the sheriff and Clara. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was just a wall of muscle clad in worn denim. "Sheriff," Silas said. His voice was flat, cold. "Rough winter we're having," Vance said, leaning forward on the saddle horn. He didn't look at Silas. His pale blue eyes slid past him. They landed on Clara. They moved down to her belly. They lingered there. A slow, greasy smirk crawled across his face. Clara felt a hot spike of anger in her chest. She didn't look away. She stared right back. "State your business, Vance," Silas said. The gravel in his voice deepened. Vance chuckled. It was a dry, rattling sound. "Just checking on my constituents, Silas, making sure the county is orderly. I hear things in town. People talk. They say you're keeping a woman out here, a widow, heavy with child." Vance paused. He let the words hang in the freezing air. "They say it's a moral outrage," Vance continued. His tone turned mock sorrowful. "A man and a woman unmarried living under one roof. It offends the decent folks of Oak Creek. It breaks the laws of decency." "She is my housekeeper," Silas said. "She has her quarters, I have mine. It's a lawful arrangement." "Lawful?" Vance laughed. "The law is what I say it is, Silas, and I say this arrangement makes you look mighty unfit to hold that prime piece of grazing land up north. You know, the acreage we've been disputing. The county might just decide to repossess it. Give it to someone with better moral standing." It was a shakedown, plain and simple. He was using Clara's ruined reputation to steal Silas's land. Silas's hands curled into fists at his sides. His shoulders bunched. The violence in him was sudden and terrifying. He took half a step forward. "Silas!" Clara's voice was sharp, clear like a ringing bell. Silas stopped. He looked back at her. Clara stepped out from behind him. She walked to the very edge of the porch. She stood eye to eye with the sheriff sitting on his high horse. She didn't cower. She didn't hide her stomach. She stood proud. "Sheriff Vance," Clara said. The air around them seemed to crackle. "My dignity is not appraised by your narrow-minded prejudices." Vance's smirk faltered. He blinked, surprised by her tone. Women in trouble were supposed to weep. They were supposed to beg. "Excuse me?" Vance sneered. "You heard me," Clara said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You are using my tragic circumstances as a weapon to steal this man's property. Let me be perfectly clear with you. The law was created to protect human rights, Sheriff. It was not created to serve as a tool for corrupt men to suffocate the vulnerable." Vance's face turned an ugly mottled red. "You listen to me, you little tramp." "No, you listen," Clara interrupted. Her voice carried the absolute authority of a woman who had faced death and no longer feared petty tyrants. "A woman's worth is not dictated by the gossip of idle townsfolk. And a man's property rights are not invalidated by your twisted definition of morality. Every citizen has a right to fair treatment under the law. Equal treatment. If you attempt to seize this land without a legitimate court order based on surveying facts, I will personally draft the petition to the territorial judge in Topeka." Vance stared at her. His mouth was slightly open. He looked at Silas. Silas was watching Clara, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound respect. "This isn't over, Thorne," Vance spat. He yanked the reins hard. The black horse reared slightly. "You think you can harbor a stray and keep your land? We'll see what the town has to say when you come looking for winter seed." Vance spurred his horse. He rode off hard, kicking up a spray of black mud. The silence rushed back in, heavy, electric. Clara stood on the porch, her chest heaving. Her hands were shaking. She hid them in the folds of her apron. Silas turned to her. He didn't speak for a long time. "You didn't have to do that," he finally said. "Yes, I did," Clara replied. "He was using me to get to you. I won't allow my existence to be your ruin." Silas shook his head slowly. "He's the law, Clara. He can make things very hard for us." "He is not the law," Clara corrected him firmly. "He is a man wearing a badge. There is a difference. The law requires proof. It requires boundaries." 2 days later, Silas rode into Oak Creek for supplies. He returned 4 hours later. The back of the wagon was empty. Clara met him at the door. She looked at his grim face. She looked at the empty wagon bed. "McCready refused to sell to you," she stated. It wasn't a question. Silas took off his hat. He brushed a hand through his dark, messy hair. Vance got to them, threatened to pull their business licenses if they traded with me, said I was harboring a public nuisance. He walked to the hearth. He stared into the fire. The defeat in his posture was heavy. The northern acreage has a stream. Without it, my cattle die in the summer heat. If I lose that land, I lose the ranch. Clara didn't offer pity. Pity was useless. She walked over to the wooden cabinet. She opened it. She pulled out a heavy metal lockbox Silas kept on the bottom shelf. She carried it to the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "Open it," Clara said. Silas frowned. "Those are just old deeds. Tax papers." "Open it, Silas." He pulled a small iron key from his pocket. He unlocked the box. Clara reached in. She pulled out a stack of yellowed, brittle papers. She spread them out on the oak table. She leaned over them, tracing the faded ink with her finger. "When I taught school, I taught civics," Clara said, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. "I taught my students how a society is supposed to function. Let's see how your property lines are actually drawn." Silas walked over. He stood beside her. He looked down at the papers. "Here," Clara tapped a specific paragraph. "The original deed from 1873. The northern boundary is marked by the split rock formation and the old oak stump, not by a straight surveyor's line." She looked up at him. Her eyes were fierce, brilliant. "Vance isn't arguing a boundary dispute," Clara said explicitly. "He's attempting a systematic land grab through intimidation. But justice isn't a natural occurrence, Silas. It doesn't just happen because you are right. It is something we must actively claim with truth, with evidence, and with a demand for equality before the law. We are going to build a case, and we are going to fight him." Silas looked at the fragile paper. Then he looked at the woman beside him. A woman the world had thrown away. For the first time in 13 years, Silas Thorne felt something he thought was dead forever. Hope. It happened on a Tuesday, mid-January. The wind was quiet. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on the cabin roof. Clara was at the stove stirring a pot of beans. Silas was at the table carefully copying the original property deed with fresh ink in a steady hand, just as Clara had instructed him. A frantic, echoing thump, thump, thump hit the heavy oak door. Silas dropped his pen. Ink splattered across the table. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy revolver holstered on his hip. He unbolted the door and pulled it open. A man fell into the room. He was covered in frost. His face was gray. His eyes were wild. It was Lars Eriksson, the Swedish farmer who lived 3 miles east. "Silas," Lars gasped. He grabbed the front of Silas's shirt with trembling hands. "Silas, please, God, please." "Lars, calm down. What is it?" Silas held the man up. "It's Marta," Lars choked out. Tears were freezing on his cheeks. "The baby. It's coming early, so early. Something is wrong. There is so much blood, Silas. The midwife in town won't come in this cold. You are a doctor. You have to come." The word hit the room like a gunshot. "Doctor." Silas froze. The color drained from his face. His hands, gripping Lars's shoulders, suddenly went rigid. His breath hitched in his chest. He didn't see Lars anymore. He didn't see the cabin. He saw a canvas tent. He smelled sulfur and rotting flesh. He saw a 16-year-old boy on a blood-soaked table. He felt the scalpel slipping in his hands. He heard the final rattling breath. No, Silas thought. The panic seized his throat. "I can't. I killed them. I can't." "Silas!" Lars screamed, shaking him. "She is dying." I am not," Silas stammered. He backed away. He literally stepped backward, bumping into the table. His hands were shaking violently. "I don't practice. I can't do it." Clara didn't hesitate. She turned away from the stove. She walked straight to the wooden cabinet. She threw the doors open. She grabbed her own canvas bag of herbs. Then she reached down and grabbed the leather roll of surgical instruments, the ones she had polished. She shoved the heavy roll into Silas's chest. Silas gasped, taking it automatically. "Hitch the wagon," Clara commanded. Her voice left no room for debate. It was the voice of a commander on a battlefield. "Put every blanket we own in the back, now." Silas stared at her, paralyzed by his ghosts. Clara stepped closer. She grabbed the collar of his shirt. She pulled him down slightly so he had to look her in the eye. "That woman's life is sacred," Clara said fiercely. "And it is slipping away. Move." The command broke the spell. Silas blinked. He turned and ran out the door. The ride to Lars' farm was a blur of whipping wind and snapping reins. Silas drove the team like a madman. Clara clung to the bench, praying her own baby wouldn't be shaken loose by the violent jolts. They burst into Lars's cabin. The smell hit them first. Copper, sweat, fear. Marta was on the bed. She was pale as snow. She was thrashing, screaming in a high, thin voice. The sheets beneath her were soaked in bright red blood. Clara dropped her coat. She didn't look at Silas. She went straight to the bed. "Lars, boil water! Tear clean sheets into strips, now!" Clara barked. She rolled up her sleeves. She pressed her hands to Marta's swollen belly. She felt the position of the child. "It's breech," Clara said over her shoulder. "Feet first, and she's tearing." Clara went to work. She was precise. She was calm. She used her hands to manually turn the infant inside the womb. It was agonizing work. Marta screamed until her voice gave out. Silas stood in the corner of the room. He was pinned to the wall by his own terror. He watched Clara's hands. He saw the blood. The ghosts screamed in his ears. "Push, Marta!" Clara yelled. "Push now!" With a final horrific effort, the baby slipped free. A boy. Tiny. Blue. Silent. Clara quickly cleared the infant's airway with her finger. She rubbed his chest vigorously with a rough towel. A second later, a thin, reedy wail pierced the room. Lars collapsed to his knees, sobbing. But Clara didn't smile. She looked down at the bed. The blood wasn't stopping. It was pooling fast, too fast. An arterial tear. "Lars, take the baby," Clara said tightly. She handed the crying infant to the father. Clara grabbed a handful of yarrow powder from her bag. She pressed it directly against the source of the bleeding. It wasn't enough. The pressure was too great. The tear was too deep. "Silas!" Clara shouted. Silas flinched. Clara turned her head. Her eyes locked onto his across the bloody room. "She is bleeding out. I cannot stop it with herbs. She needs a suture. Deep tissue." Silas shook his head. He pressed himself harder against the wall. "I'll kill her." "She is already dying," Clara roared. It was a raw, primal sound. "You have the skill. Pick up the needle and save her." Silas looked at the leather roll sitting on the table. He looked at the dying woman. He looked at the tiny, crying infant in Lars's arms. A choice. Run from the ghosts or fight for the living. Silas pushed off the wall. He walked to the table. He untied the leather roll. The polished steel gleamed in the lamplight. He picked up a curved needle. He picked up a pair of forceps. He picked up a spool of catgut. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely thread the needle. Clara reached out. Her blood-stained hand wrapped over his large, trembling knuckles. "Breathe," she whispered. Silas took a deep, shuddering breath. The shaking lessened. Just enough. He moved in. Clara held the pressure. Silas worked. It wasn't elegant. It was frantic, bloody, desperate work. He clamped the artery. He threw the stitches, pulling tight, knotting, moving to the next. 10 minutes later, he tied off the final suture. He dropped the needle. They waited. 10 seconds, 20. The bleeding slowed. Then it stopped. Marta was unconscious, but her chest was rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Her pulse was weak, but it was there. Silas stepped back. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in blood. But it wasn't the blood of a dead soldier. It was the blood of a living mother. He turned away and walked out into the freezing night. The ride back to their ranch was silent. The storm had passed. The stars were brilliant, hard points of light in the black sky. Silas drove the wagon slowly. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Clara sat beside him. She was wrapped in 3 blankets. She felt the steady kick of her own child inside her. A miracle of life. Silas kept his eyes on the road. "I lost a boy," Silas said suddenly. His voice was cracked, hollow. "Gettysburg. He was 16. Shrapnel in his abdomen. I tried to sew him up. My hands were tired. I slipped. I nicked an artery. He bled out on the table while I watched." He swallowed hard. "I promised God I would never hold a knife over another human being again." Clara looked at him. She saw the profound weight he had been carrying for 13 years. She didn't reach out to pat his arm. She didn't offer a soft platitude about it not being his fault. Platitudes were insults to a man's trauma. Instead, Clara turned to fully face him in the dark. "Listen to me carefully, Silas," Clara said. Her words were deliberate, spoken with absolute clarity. "I saw your hands shake tonight. I saw your terror, but you fought through it. You fought for that mother's right to live." Silas gripped the reins tighter. "I almost couldn't do it." "But you did," Clara insisted. "Life is sacred, Silas. It is inherently valuable. Because it is sacred, it is always worth trying to save, regardless of the odds, regardless of your fear. When you walked away from medicine, you didn't punish yourself. You punished the world by taking away a man who cares enough to be terrified." Silas turned his head to look at her. The moonlight caught the moisture in his dark eyes. "You didn't fail that boy in the past," Clara said explicitly, ensuring the truth of her words landed deep in his soul. "War is the only true failure. War destroys the right to life. You are a healer. Tonight, you claim that title back." Silas looked back at the road. He didn't say anything for the rest of the journey. But as they pulled into the yard of their cabin, Silas reached over. He didn't look at her, but he gently rested his large, rough hand over her gloved hand for just a second. A silent thank you, a silent promise. He was finally coming back to life. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who needs inspiration, and subscribe for more powerful Western tales. Christmas Eve. The prairie was buried under 2 feet of snow. The world outside was dead, silent, and painted in shades of icy blue. Inside the cabin, it was warm. The fire burned low, reducing thick oak logs to glowing orange embers. The clock on the mantel ticked, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the quiet room. Clara sat in the rocking chair. She had a heavy quilt pulled over her lap. Her hands rested on her stomach. The baby was restless tonight, kicking hard against her ribs. Silas was at the table. He was cleaning his rifle. The smell of gun oil mixed with the scent of burning wood and dried sage. He worked the rag over the steel barrel, smooth, practiced. They had been living under the same roof for 2 months. 2 months of shared meals, shared chores, shared silence. But tonight the silence felt different. It was heavy, thick with the things they hadn't said. Clara watched the firelight dance across Silas's face, the harsh lines around his mouth, the deep shadows under his eyes. He was a man holding up the sky, refusing to let his arms shake. "William was a dreamer," Clara said. The words cut through the quiet. They sounded loud, intrusive. Silas stopped wiping the rifle. He didn't look up right away. He set the rag down. Then he turned his head. He looked at her, waiting. Clara didn't look away from the embers. "My husband," she clarified. Her voice was steady, but there was a raw edge to it. He looked at a map and saw gold. He saw endless wheat. He saw a kingdom. He didn't see the dirt. He didn't see the winters. He just saw the dream. She took a slow breath. "I told him we weren't ready. I told him Tennessee was safe. I had my teaching. I had my mother's apothecary. We had a life, but he wouldn't listen. A man's pride is a dangerous engine, Silas. It drives him right off the cliff, and he drags his family down with him." Silas leaned back in his chair. He brought you out here. He did, and he died doing it. Typhoid, a preventable fever. He drank bad water from a shallow well because he was in too much of a hurry to dig a proper one. Clara finally turned her head. She met Silas's dark eyes. I am angry with him, she confessed. The admission felt like pulling a thorn out of her chest. I am so incredibly angry. He left me here, pregnant, penniless. He left me to freeze in the mud, and then I feel guilty. She gripped the quilt tight. Her knuckles turned white in the dim light. I feel guilty for hating a dead man. The pastor back home would say it's a sin. A wife must honor her husband in life and in death. But how do you honor foolishness? How do you forgive a man who isn't here to apologize? Silas sat in the shadows. He understood the weight of the dead. He carried an entire graveyard on his own back. You don't have to forgive him right now, Silas said. His voice was a low rumble. And you don't have to pretend he was a saint. Death doesn't make a man perfect. It just makes him gone. Clara let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for months. She looked at Silas. Really looked at him. The ex-doctor who hid on a ranch. The man who saved a mother's life with shaking hands, then retreated back into his shell of guilt. You do the same thing, Silas, Clara said gently. He stiffened. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Clara sat up a little straighter. You keep that boy from Gettysburg alive in your head. You punish yourself every single day. You think if you just suffer enough, if you just isolate yourself enough, it somehow balances the scales. But it doesn't. Silas stood up. He walked to the window. He stared out into the pitch-black night. His broad back was rigid, a wall built to keep the world out. I held his heart in my hands, Clara. I felt it stop. You don't just walk away from that. No, you don't. Clara didn't back down. She spoke to his back. But healing isn't forcing yourself to forget the wound, Silas. And it isn't denying your anger or your guilt. Healing is when we decide that the pain will no longer have the right to rule the rest of our lives. You are allowing your past to dictate your present. You are denying yourself a life because you think you don't deserve one. Silas turned around. The raw pain in his eyes was staggering. Do I? He asked quietly. Deserve one? Every human being deserves the grace to start over, Clara stated clearly, making sure the words landed. Grace isn't a reward for perfect behavior. It's a fundamental right. We are allowed to be broken, Silas, but we are also allowed to put the pieces back together. The silence returned, but the tension was gone. The air felt clear, washed clean. Silas walked over to the wooden cabinet. He opened the top drawer. He pulled something out, a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He walked over to Clara. He held it out. Merry Christmas, he said. Clara looked at the package. She looked up at him. She took it slowly. She untied the twine. She folded back the paper. It was a book, large, heavy, bound in dark green leather, gold lettering on the spine. Culpepper's Complete Herbal and English Physician. It was an expensive text, a rare one out here. I ordered it from St. Louis, Silas said, rubbing the back of his neck, suddenly looking awkward. 2 months ago. I noticed you reading your mother's journal. I thought you might want to expand your practice. Clara ran her hand over the embossed leather. It was the most thoughtful thing anyone had ever given her. He wasn't just giving her a book. He was validating her intellect. He was telling her he believed in her worth. She swallowed hard. Thank you. It is beautiful. She reached down into the deep pocket of her apron. She pulled out a small bundle. I don't have access to catalogs in St. Louis, she said softly. She held the bundle out to him. Silas took it. He unfolded it. It was a wool beanie, hand-knitted. The yarn was a dark charcoal gray. It wasn't perfect. A few of the stitches on the left side were uneven, where her fingers had stiffened from the cold. Silas held the small hat in his massive hands. He traced the uneven stitches with his thumb. "I noticed you don't wear a hat when you chop wood," Clara said. "You just let the snow freeze in your hair. It's foolish." Silas looked down at the imperfect warm wool. Then he looked at Clara. He didn't smile, but the hard lines around his eyes softened completely. He pulled the beanie over his head. It fit perfectly. "It's not foolish anymore," he said. They sat together by the fire for a long time. No more words were needed. The armor had cracked. The light was finally getting in. January came in like a hammer. The cold was unrelenting. The sky was the color of dirty lead. Silas rode out to check the herd early Tuesday morning. Clara was alone at the cabin. She was rolling out biscuit dough on the floured table. She heard a horse approach. Not Silas's heavy draft horse. A lighter step. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the window. Sheriff Thaddeus Vance was tying his black gelding to the porch rail. Clara's heart kicked against her ribs. She moved to the door, ensuring the iron deadbolt was thrown. She stepped back, waiting. A heavy knock. "Mrs. Bennett, I know you're in there. Open up." "I have nothing to say to you, Sheriff," Clara called through the thick oak. "But I have something to say to you," Vance replied. His muffled voice was smooth, poisonous. "And it concerns Silas Thorne's immediate future in a federal penitentiary." Clara froze. She unlocked the door. She opened it just a crack. Vance stood on the porch. He didn't push his way in. He just held up a thick manila envelope. "May I speak plainly, ma'am?" Vance asked, his fake politeness dripping with malice. "Make it quick." Vance smiled. "Silas is a stubborn man. He won't give up that northern pasture, but he's vulnerable. You see, the territorial judge is coming to Oak Creek next week to hear the boundary dispute. I intend to file a secondary charge against Mr. Thorne, practicing medicine without a license, and harboring a public nuisance." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Lars Eriksson won't testify against Silas. Silas saved his wife." "Lars is a Swedish immigrant who owes taxes," Vance sneered. "He'll say whatever I tell him to say to keep his farm. Silas will go to prison. The bank will take this ranch. He will lose everything." Vance pushed the envelope through the crack in the door. "Inside is a train ticket to Denver, and $50 cash. Enough to set up a nice life for you and the bastard child. You leave tomorrow on the morning stage. You disappear. And I drop the charges against Silas. He keeps his ranch. He loses the pasture, but he stays a free man." Vance stepped back. "A woman who truly cares for a man wouldn't be the cause of his ruin, Mrs. Bennett. Think about it." He turned. He mounted his horse. He rode away. Clara stood in the doorway. The freezing wind bit through her dress. She looked down at the envelope in her hand. It felt like holding a live coal. She closed the door. She walked into her bedroom. She pulled her canvas bag from under the bed. She began to pack. 2 dresses, the medical journal, the heavy green book Silas had given her. Tears pricked her eyes. She blinked them away angrily. She was not crying. She was surviving. She was saving him. The front door opened. "Wind is picking up," Silas's voice boomed through the cabin. He stopped. He saw the open bedroom door. He saw the canvas bag on the bed. He saw the envelope of cash sitting on the quilt. Silas walked slowly into the room. He looked at the bag. He looked at Clara. "Vance was here," Silas stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Clara folded a shawl. Her hands were shaking. She didn't look up. "He threatened you." "He threatened you," Clara corrected, finally looking at him. "He's going to charge you. He's going to take the ranch, Silas. He has Lars boxed in. If I stay, you lose everything." Silas stared at her. His jaw clenched tight. "So you're running." "I am leaving to protect you," Clara snapped, her voice rising. "I won't let you go to a federal prison because you were decent enough to take me in." Silas didn't yell back. He took a step closer. The quiet intensity in his eyes was far more intimidating than a shout. "You think you're saving me," Silas said. His voice was dangerously low. But you're just doing exactly what I did. You're deciding that you don't deserve a home. You're sacrificing yourself because you think your life is worth less than a piece of dirt and a few head of cattle. It's practical, Silas. It's cowardice, Silas shot back. Clara flinched. You told me to fight for the living, Clara. You told me my guilt didn't serve anyone. Well, look at yourself. You are letting a corrupt man with a tin star tell you what you are worth. You are letting him run you out of your own home. Clara stared at him. The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She looked at the bag. She looked at the money. She was acting like a victim. She was acting like the helpless widow Oak Creek thought she was. She reached out. She picked up the envelope. She walked to the hearth and threw the money and the tickets straight into the fire. The paper flared up. Black smoke curled up the chimney. "Hitch the wagon," Clara said. Her voice was suddenly lethal, cold as the ice outside. Silas watched the fire. "Where are we going?" "To Judge Webb's farm," Clara said. She walked to the table. She grabbed the copied deed. "Vance wants to play with the law. We are going to show him exactly what the law looks like." Judge Horace Webb lived 5 miles south. He was a retired circuit judge, a man who valued whiskey, quiet, and the absolute letter of the law. Clara and Silas sat in his parlor. It smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. Judge Webb sat behind his massive mahogany desk. He looked at the copy of the deed Silas had made. He looked at Clara. "This is a neat copy, Mrs. Bennett," Webb said, his voice gravelly. "But Vance has filed a claim that the original markers have moved over time. He has the county surveyor in his pocket. Without the original document, which burned in the courthouse fire of '76, it's Silas's word against the sheriff's." Clara leaned forward. She placed her hands flat on the desk. "I don't just have a copy, Your Honor. I have the exact wording, verbatim." Webb raised an eyebrow. "From memory?" "From memory. I have a photographic recall. I read the original document in Mr. Thorne's lockbox before he returned it to the bank. Page 2, paragraph 4. The northern boundary shall hold fast to the granite split rock formation, immutable and fixed, regardless of the shifting of the seasonal creek bed." Webb looked at Silas. "Is this true?" "Word for word," Silas confirmed. Clara didn't stop. She locked eyes with the judge. "Sheriff Vance is attempting to extort this property. He threatened to arrest Mr. Thorne on fabricated charges if I did not leave the territory. I will swear to that under oath." "Mrs. Bennett," Webb sighed, "you are a pregnant widow living with an unmarried man. In a courtroom, Vance's lawyer will tear your character to shreds. They will say you are a woman of loose morals. They will say your word means nothing." Clara stood up. She placed both hands on her swollen belly. She stood tall, commanding the room. "My character is not determined by my marital status, Judge Webb. Justice isn't a natural occurrence. It is something we must actively claim with truth, with evidence, and with a demand for equality before the law. If the law allows a corrupt man to steal a citizen's livelihood simply because the primary witness is an unmarried mother, then the law is a farce. Are you a man who upholds the law, or a man who cowers to local gossip?" The room went dead silent. Judge Webb stared at her. A slow, genuine smile spread across his wrinkled face. "Mrs. Bennett," Webb chuckled, "you would have made one hell of a lawyer. I will issue an injunction against Vance tomorrow morning. He won't touch that land, or Mr. Thorne." They walked out to the wagon. The wind had died down. The victory tasted sweet. Silas helped her up onto the bench. He climbed up beside her. He picked up the reins. "You were terrifying in there," Silas said. A rare, genuine grin touched his mouth. Clara smiled back. "I was a school teacher. I know how to handle unruly boys." Silas snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward. Clara gasped. It wasn't a bump in the road. It was a sharp, tearing agony that ripped straight through her core. It took her breath away entirely. She doubled over, grabbing Silas's arm with a grip like a vice. "Clara?" Silas dropped the reins. Panic flared in his eyes. "It's time," Clara gritted out, her face instantly pale. "The baby, it's coming now." There was no time to panic, no time for ghosts. Silas grabbed the reins. He didn't hesitate. He drove the horses hard, racing the setting sun back to the cabin. The storm was over, but the real fight was just beginning. The baby was 3 weeks old. They named him Samuel. He was small, but he was loud. His cries filled the cabin, chasing away the heavy silence that had lived in the timber walls for years. It was late February. The worst of the winter had broken. The sun actually felt warm through the window glass. Clara sat in the rocking chair. Samuel was asleep against her chest. She rubbed his small back. Her body was still healing. She was tired. A bone-deep, heavy kind of tired. But her mind was quiet. The front door opened. Silas stepped inside. He stomped the mud off his boots. He took off his hat. He held a small stack of mail in his left hand. He had ridden into Oak Creek that morning. He didn't ask Clara for permission to face the town. He just went. He walked over to this table. He set the supplies down: flour, coffee, sugar. Then he looked at the letters. "Mail train came through," Silas said. His voice was low. He didn't want to wake the boy. He sorted through the envelopes. He stopped. He stared at a square, slightly wrinkled piece of parchment. Clara watched him. She saw his shoulders go rigid. She saw the color drain from his face, leaving his weathered skin looking like ash. "Silas?" she asked softly. He didn't answer. He ripped the envelope open. His large thumbs fumbled with the delicate paper. He unfolded the letter. He read it once. Then he read it again. His hand began to shake. Not a little tremor. A violent, uncontrollable shake. The paper rattled. He dropped the letter on the table. He backed away from it like it was a coiled snake. He put his hands on his hips. He looked up at the ceiling. He took a ragged, gasping breath. "What is it?" Clara asked. She didn't move. She didn't want to startle him. Silas looked at her. His eyes were wide, devastated, and completely unmasked. "It's from my sister," Silas whispered. His voice broke. "Martha, in Illinois." Clara waited. "She went to a veterans gathering," Silas continued, the words tumbling out of him like rocks down a hillside. "A hospital reunion. She met a nurse there, an older woman, from my old field unit at Gettysburg." He swallowed hard. He looked back at the paper on the table. "The nurse remembered me," Silas said. "She remembered the boy, the 16-year-old, the one who bled out on my table." Clara stopped rocking. She held Samuel a little tighter. "What did she say, Silas?" Silas closed his eyes. The first tear escaped. It tracked through the dust on his cheek, then another. "The nurse was with him at the very end," Silas choked out. "After I walked away, after I couldn't look at what I'd done, the boy was fading, but he grabbed the nurse's apron, and he told her to give me a message." Silas raised his hands and covered his face. His massive shoulders shook. A sob, trapped in his chest for 13 years, finally ripped free. He said to tell the doctor it was all right. He said, tell him he tried his best and I don't blame him. He forgave me. Before he died, he forgave me. Silas fell to his knees on the hard wooden floor. He wept. It wasn't a quiet weeping. It was the loud, ugly, shattering cry of a man who had carried a mountain on his back for over a decade, only to realize the mountain was made of dust. Clara didn't hesitate. She stood up. She carried the sleeping baby over to the wooden crib Silas had built. She laid Samuel down gently. She walked over to Silas. She sank to her knees right in front of him. She didn't offer empty words. She wrapped her arms around his broad, shaking shoulders. She pulled his head to her chest. She held him fiercely. He clung to her. He buried his face in her shoulder. He cried for the boy. He cried for the years he had stolen from himself. He cried for the man he used to be. Clara held him until the shaking stopped, until his breathing slowed, until the shadows in the room began to stretch long across the floor. Slowly, Silas pulled back. He sat back on his heels. He wiped his face with the back of his rough hand. He looked exhausted, but he looked lighter. He looked at Clara. "You told me once that I was punishing the world by taking away a man who cared," Silas said. His voice was hoarse, raw. "I remember," Clara said. Silas reached out. He took her hands in his. He held them tight. "You were right," Silas said. He looked her directly in the eyes. His gaze was steady, clear. "Forgiving oneself isn't a selfish act, Clara. It isn't a luxury. It is the most fundamental right a person must grant themselves before they have the strength to fully love another human being. A broken man can offer shelter, but only a healed man can offer a life." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She squeezed his hands. "I'm done punishing myself," Silas said. The conviction in his voice was absolute. "I'm done hiding in this cabin. I'm a doctor, I'm a rancher, and—" He paused. He looked over at the crib, then back to her. "And I want to be your husband." It wasn't a question asked out of duty. It wasn't pity. It wasn't convenience. "I am a difficult woman, Silas," Clara said, a small, watery smile touching her lips. "I argue. I correct people. I will never back down when I know I am right." "I know," Silas said. A genuine smile broke across his face. It changed him completely. "That's exactly why I need you. I'm asking you to stay, Clara. Not as a housekeeper, as my equal. Choose me, because I am choosing you." Clara looked at the man kneeling in front of her, the man who had saved her life, the man whose life she had saved right back. "Yes," Clara said. Simple, true. "I choose you." April brought the thaw. The mud dried. The prairie grass turned a brilliant, violent green. The world was waking up. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp and smelled of rain and blooming sage. There was no church. There was no white dress. Clara didn't want either. They stood on the front porch of the cabin, the porch where Clara had stood down the sheriff, the porch that marked the boundary of their safe harbor. Clara wore her best dress, dark blue wool, freshly brushed. Her hair was pinned up neat. She held Samuel in her arms. He was wrapped in a soft white blanket she had sewn by the fire. Silas stood beside her. He wore a clean white shirt, a black string tie. His dark hair was combed back. He looked tall, imposing, but his eyes were warm. Judge Horace Webb stood facing them. He held a small, leather-bound book. Lars Eriksson and his wife Marta stood in the yard. Marta was pale, but she was smiling. She held her own baby boy. They were the only guests. They were the only ones who mattered. "We are gathered here not by the dictates of a town," Judge Webb began, his voice carrying over the quiet breeze, "but by the dictates of the law and the deeper dictates of the human heart." He looked at Silas. "Silas Nathaniel Thorne, do you have words you wish to speak before the law binds you to this woman?" Silas turned to Clara. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Lars. He looked only at her. "I do," Silas said. He reached out. He placed his large, calloused hand gently over Clara's, where she supported the baby. "I choose you, Clara Jane Bennett," Silas said. His voice was steady. It rang like a bell in the morning air. "And I choose your son, Samuel. I do not do this out of pity. I do not do this out of duty. I do this because every life is sacred, and because absolute equality in love and mutual respect is the only acceptable foundation for a true family." He paused, letting the words settle. "I vow to treat you as my partner," Silas continued explicitly. "Your voice will always equal mine. Your rights in this home are absolute. I will protect you. I will honor your mind. And I will love you until the dirt takes me." Clara's eyes shone with unshed tears. She looked at the strong, gentle man beside her. "And I choose you, Silas," Clara replied. Her voice was fiercely clear. I bring my mind, my hands, and my heart to this union. We are partners in the light and in the dark. I vow to honor the healer in you. I vow to stand shoulder to shoulder with you against whatever storms come. We are equals, today and every day after." Judge Webb smiled. He closed his little book. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Kansas, I pronounce you husband and wife. You have forged this union with your own strength. May no man tear it down." Silas leaned in. He kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It was a promise pressed against her lips, a seal on a contract they had written with their souls. Lars clapped his hands. Marta cheered softly. Samuel let out a little squeak. An hour later, the wagon was hitched. "Are you ready for this?" Silas asked, helping Clara up onto the wooden bench. "I am," Clara said. She settled Samuel into his basket at her feet. They weren't just going for a ride. They were going to Oak Creek. It was a deliberate act, a statement. They had won the legal battle against Sheriff Vance. Judge Webb's injunction had stopped the land grab cold. Now they had to win the social battle. They had to face the town that had tried to throw them away. The ride was quiet, but it wasn't tense. They drove down the main street of Oak Creek. The wagon wheels rattled against the dry ruts. People stopped on the boardwalks. Women in bonnets turned to whisper. Men tipped their hats back, staring. Clara didn't shrink down. She sat tall, her shoulders back, her chin raised. She was Mrs. Silas Thorne. She had nothing to hide and nothing to apologize for. Silas drove the team straight to McCready's general store, the man who had refused to sell to him all winter. Silas set the brake. He stepped down. He helped Clara down. He carried the basket with Samuel in one arm and offered his other arm to his wife. They walked up the wooden steps. They pushed the door open. The little bell chimed. The store went dead silent. 3 local women were at the counter. They parted like the Red Sea, their eyes wide. Mr. McCready stood behind the counter. He swallowed hard. He looked terrified. Clara walked right up to the counter. She pulled a piece of paper from her pocket. She smoothed it out on the glass display case. "Good morning, Mr. McCready," Clara said. Her tone was perfectly polite, perfectly pleasant. "I need 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of sugar, and 3 yards of that blue gingham on the back wall. We have cash." McCready looked at the list. He looked at Silas. Silas just stared back, his face completely unreadable. McCready looked back at Clara. He nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, Mrs. Thorne." He scrambled to fill the order. Through the front window, Clara saw Sheriff Vance. He was standing across the street, leaning against the saloon hitching post. He was watching them. He didn't cross the street. He didn't make a move. He just watched the men load the heavy sacks of flour into Silas's wagon. Vance had the badge, but he had lost his power. He knew it. They knew it. Silas paid the bill. He picked up his son. He tipped his hat to McCready. "Have a good day," Silas said. They walked out into the sunlight. They climbed into the wagon. Silas snapped the reins and the horses moved out. Clara looked at Silas. He looked at her. They had faced the fire. They hadn't burned. They had turned to steel. Summer, 1882. 3 years later. The Kansas heat was a living thing. It baked the earth until it cracked. It turned the sky a hazy, brilliant white. But on the porch of the Thorne Ranch, there was shade. A large wooden sign hung from a sturdy post near the front gate. The letters were painted in clean black strokes. S. Thorne, M.D., and C. Thorne, herbalist. It wasn't a grand hospital. It was a renovated section of the barn. But people came. They came from Oak Creek. They came from the neighboring counties. They came because Silas Thorne had steady hands, and his wife knew how to brew willow bark so it took away the fever without burning the stomach. More importantly, they came because the Thornes didn't turn anyone away. If a man couldn't pay in coin, he paid in chickens. If he didn't have chickens, he paid in a promise. Clara sat in the wide rocking chair on the porch. She was pregnant again, 8 months along. Her belly was perfectly round. But her face wasn't lined with fear this time. There was no terror in her eyes, only a deep, settled contentment. She held a slate board in her lap. Sitting on the top step of the porch was Samuel. He was 3.5 years old. He wore denim overalls and a tiny straw hat that kept falling over his dark eyes. He held a piece of white chalk in his chubby fist. "All right, Sammy," Clara said. "What is the next letter?" Samuel frowned in intense concentration. He stuck his tongue out the corner of his mouth. He drew a jagged, uneven line, then a loop. "P," he announced proudly. "Very good," Clara smiled. "And what does P stand for?" "Papa," Samuel shouted. Right on cue, Silas walked around the corner of the cabin. He had his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He carried a wooden bucket of fresh water from the pump. The sun caught the silver starting to streak through his dark hair. "Someone called for me?" Silas asked, setting the bucket down. Samuel scrambled up. He ran down the steps. "Papa, look, I wrote your name." Silas knelt in the dirt. He didn't care about the dust on his trousers. He tipped Samuel's straw hat back. He looked at the slate board Clara held up. "That is a mighty fine P, Samuel," Silas said seriously. "Best one I've ever seen." Samuel beamed. He threw his arms around Silas's thick neck. Silas picked him up effortlessly, settling the boy on his hip. Silas walked up the steps. He kissed Clara's forehead. He rested a hand on her swollen stomach for a brief, quiet moment, a silent check, a habit he couldn't break. A habit he... "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I swallowed a watermelon," Clara laughed softly. "But good, very good." "The Miller family just left the clinic," Silas said, taking a seat on the wooden bench across from her. "The little girl's fever broke. Your elderberry syrup did the trick. Mr. Miller tried to give me his good hunting knife for payment. I told him to keep it to feed his family. He left us a bushel of sweet corn instead." Clara smiled. She set the slate board down. She looked out over the property. The fence lines were straight. The cattle were fat. The land was theirs, secure and undisputed. She looked at her son playing with the buttons on Silas's shirt. "Samuel," Clara said. Her tone shifted. It became the tone of a teacher, the tone of a mother passing on the things that mattered most. Samuel stopped playing. He looked at her. "Do you know why Papa didn't take Mr. Miller's knife?" Clara asked. Samuel shook his head. "Because we have knives in the kitchen?" "No," Clara said gently. She leaned forward. "Listen to me, Samuel. I want you to remember this. A person's value isn't found in the money in their pocket. It isn't found in the clothes on their back or the size of their house. Those things are just dust." She looked at Silas. He was watching her, his eyes full of that same profound respect he had shown her in the freezing barn all those years ago. "A human being's worth," Clara stated explicitly, her voice ringing clear in the summer air, "is found in the compassion they show to others. It is found in how we reach out to protect those who are more vulnerable than ourselves. We help people because every life is sacred. Do you understand?" Samuel looked at her serious face. He nodded his little head slowly. "Help people. Because life is sacred." "Exactly," Clara smiled. "Never let anyone tell you different, no matter what badge they wear or how loud they yell. You treat people with dignity." "Yes, Mama." Silas kissed the top of Samuel's head. He set the boy down. "Go check the chicken coop, Sammy, see if we have eggs for supper." Samuel grabbed a little woven basket and took off running toward the barn, his little legs pumping fast. Silas stood up. He walked over to Clara. He leaned against the porch rail, looking down at her. The sun was beginning to set. The sky turned a brilliant, bruised purple and gold. The air finally began to cool. "He's going to be a good man," Silas said softly. "With a mother like you, he doesn't have a choice." Clara reached out. She took Silas's rough, scarred hand in hers. She held it against her cheek. "He's going to be a good man because he has a father who shows him what honor actually looks like every single day," Clara replied. They sat together on the porch as the Kansas sun sank below the horizon. The crickets started their evening song. There were no more ghosts to fight. There were no more corrupt sheriffs or freezing nights. There was just the land, the work, and the family they had built from the ashes of their pasts. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was a life they had chosen. And they chose it again, every single day. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
As the prairie wind settles and the echoes of hardship fade into the horizon, what remains is not just the story of Clara and Silas, but a quiet, enduring truth about what it means to be human. In a world that judged too quickly and helped too little, Clara stood firm in her dignity when it would have been easier to surrender. She refused to trade her child, her self-worth, or her voice for comfort. And in doing so, she reminded us that dignity is not something granted by society. It is something we must defend, even when we stand alone. Silas, on the other hand, carried a different burden, the weight of guilt, of failure, of a past that refused to loosen its grip. Yet through compassion, through courage, and through the presence of someone who saw him not as broken, but as worthy, he found his way back to purpose. Together, they built something rare on that unforgiving land, not just a home, but a partnership rooted in equality, respect, and truth. This story teaches us that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is found in a quiet refusal to give up. It is in choosing to fight for what is right, even when the odds are stacked against you. It is in understanding that healing is not about forgetting the past, but about refusing to let it define your future. We are reminded that every life holds value, not because of status, reputation, or circumstance, but simply because it exists. And perhaps most importantly, this story shows us that love, real love, is not about saving someone or being saved. It is about standing side by side, choosing each other freely, and building something honest in a world that often rewards deception. So as you walk away from this story, carry with you this simple but powerful truth. No matter how harsh the world becomes, you always have the right to your dignity, your voice, and your chance to begin again. And sometimes, all it takes to change a life, your own or someone else's, is one act of courage, one moment of compassion, or one decision to stand your ground when everything else tells you to fall.